So welcome to the Core Online Learning, and we are going to go through as many Macbeth quotations as we can. So firstly, let's go over some characters that we might not all be completely comfortable with. So we're going to start further down the grid. And I have gone over this one in a previous video that I just uploaded, and this one is to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness often tell us truths. So I have gone over why this is quite wise from Banquo. He's talking about the witches as instruments of darkness. This is obviously a metaphor, but I find this quite interesting because what he's basically saying there is that the witches are simply instruments being played by someone else, being played by a more insidious and terrible evil. So when he says they are instruments of darkness, he's basically saying they're sort of being played by the devil or Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft that we see come up in the play. Basically, they're out for a bigger purpose, to win you to your harm. He also says they tell us truths, which is interesting because they did tell Macbeth truthful things, but it was all just sort of quite misleading, and it was all there to eventually lead him to his downfall. So Banquo is quite wise. Now remember, I said you don't need quotations in every single paragraph. You can also use textual references. We know that Banquo is a father, and quite a caring father at that. He makes sure that his child runs away from the murderers. We know that he doesn't trust the witches, which again, very important here because he's very different to Macbeth, who does trust the witches. So they are opposites. He's Macbeth's antithesis. And if you're not sure what that means, you can always look at my summary video. He does eventually get quite suspicious of Macbeth, and he says he fears he played foully for becoming king, or in order to become king. So that just shows the wisdom of Banquo, and actually it shows him to be a character that we think quite positively about. Then we've got Duncan, and Duncan is mentioned as being very generous and very pleasant. He describes Lady Macbeth as generous, which is dramatic irony. That's when the audience knows something that characters don't know. He also calls Macbeth brave and worthy. So again, he uses all these adjectives to describe Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, and it makes it more tragic when they do what they do to him, because he's so trusting and he's so sweet and he has no reason to doubt them, and yet they kill him in cold blood. So we have those points from Duncan. We also have a few textual references here that he is very generous, but he does give Macbeth the titles of the last man who betrayed him, which is quite an interesting move from Shakespeare to sort of maybe foreshadow Macbeth as a traitor as well. He was already betrayed at the start of the play, so perhaps that could mean that he's sort of too trusting and perhaps too generous, which is very different to his son. So there is sort of this difference in leadership between Duncan, who's excessively generous and excessively kind to people, and this as a king, to Malcolm's own kingship and leadership. So he actually says that Macduff shouldn't trust him. So he points out that angels are bright still, though the brightest fell. And he's actually talking about how you can't always trust people. So the brightest angel was Lucifer, who later becomes the devil when he betrays God. So actually, with this biblical allusion, spelled Allusion, which means reference, with this biblical reference, this biblical allusion, what Malcolm is actually saying is that you can't always trust people based on appearances, because even the brightest angel in heaven fell from God's graces. So it does show that he's a lot less gullible than his father, and perhaps wiser in that sense. So we trust him more when he becomes king at the end. And he does lie to Macduff to check he's telling the truth, and he doesn't blindly trust him, which again shows that different approach to leadership in that he's more cautious than his father. Now, there are a few points that you could pick up on for Macduff as we move on to him. That's not necessarily about leadership like we did with Malcolm and Duncan, but that is about Macduff and his patriotism. We've got the personification here of bleed, bleed, poor country. So again, interesting personification where he's sort of talking about how much the country suffers. He refers to Macbeth as a tyrant, and that's a really interesting word choice because he's talking about him as a horrible king, and he's really sort of adding to that idea that the country is suffering under him. We've also got a few textual references for him, so remember you can sort of zoom in on the significance of these events. The fact that he leaves his family to save his country and then feels guilt about that. So actually, when he leaves his family to save his country, we see there that he is leaving one of his great loves behind for the other one, and he regrets actually leaving them because then they are murdered. So we see actually that Macduff's sort of given everything for his country, and at the very end when he gets his revenge, it's quite sweet for the audience because we see that actually Macduff deserves that, and his wife is loyal to him to the very end. So they are this very tragic family who we would have appreciated and liked as a Jacobean audience much more than Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, because they were a traditional family, wife, children, the wife protects the husband, and actually, so it's quite sad when they're sort of taken out by Macbeth and by the murderers. And then obviously we move on to Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. So these quotations aren't necessarily all of the quotations you could use, but these are just some that I would suggest you think about or you remember for your exam. There are a few for madness. So if madness comes up, I would talk about full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife. That one's interesting because scorpions are poisonous. So that metaphor is basically showing that he believes his thoughts are poison. And that could show that to him, he's going mad and his madness is poisonous to him. Also, we've got at the end when he says, only for them and mine eternal jewel given to the common enemy of man. His eternal jewel is a metaphor for the soul. And he says, for Banquo's sons, I have given my soul. So his soul is damned to hell now that he has committed regicide and committed murder. So he's committed a sin there. Regicide meaning killing the king. And so by saying it was for them that I gave up my soul, he's acknowledging that actually he's king, but it's going to be short-lived. He's not passing that leadership down to anyone from his own line, his own son. And actually he's saying, I've done all this, and actually Banquo's sons will get the rewards. So he's questioning why he did it, and he's definitely showing some regret there. And that shows why he is ultimately led to his madness, because he doesn't actually see the point in what he's done eventually. And we've also got the hallucination of Banquo's ghost sitting in his chair. I do go over that in my longer video summarising the entire play and points that you could look at from the entire play. But it is symbolic of Banquo taking his place, and also hallucinating Banquo's ghost is symbolic of his madness. Now, we've also got Lady Macbeth's madness when she says, out damn spot. So when she's imagining herself cleaning her hands and getting rid of the blood, it's quite interesting because Macbeth at the start was thinking about all the blood on his hands and that his hands would never be clean again. And remember, the bloody hands symbolise that guilt. You've got blood on your hands, so you're guilty of murder. And he says, no, I'll never get them clean again. She says, no, a little water will do that. But now we see how she's changed her tune because she's descended into madness as well. And she doesn't seem to be able to get this blood off her hands, even though there is no blood on her hands because the murder happened a while ago. She also uses hyperbole, like all the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand, to show, to exaggerate and to emphasise just how awful she feels and just how impossible it is for her to clean her hands. Now, we've also got a lot about gender. So obviously Lady Macbeth pushes Macbeth to murder Duncan, and she's the one who tempts him. And Macbeth takes that advice from his wife, and he really respects her. So we've got this reversal of gender roles where the wife is not the one sort of serving her husband, and actually her husband, Macbeth, is serving her by doing what she's asked him to do. So there are quite a lot that sort of quotations and textual references that would sort of link to that idea of gender or masculinity. Lady Macbeth constantly asking the question, are you a man? There's a lot of repetition of that idea of her questioning him as a man. You've got Unsex Me here, where she wants the spirits to take away everything that makes her very feminine, so she would feel more powerful. But then ultimately, at the end, she does worry. She says the Thane of Fife had a wife, where is she now? The Thane of Fife is Macduff. So she looks at Macduff's wife being murdered, and Lady Macbeth realises, you know, I'm quite vulnerable here. This could happen to me. Now, in terms of Macbeth being quite obsessed with masculinity, he does say, I dare do all that may become a man. So again, he keeps linking to this idea that he does everything to make him a man. And he is a man, and he's sort of trying to push that out there, that he is masculine. He also doesn't give up at the end because he believes the witch's prophecies. Now that's interesting again because he just sort of has this quite blind faith in a lot of the women in the play, even right up till the end. So he still has faith in the witches right up until the very end. We also have a few points about deception. So a nice metaphor here of a false face, hiding what the false heart doth know. So putting on a mask, putting on a certain outer appearance to trick people into trusting you. And we've got a very similar one from Lady Macbeth, look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. Interesting that she links to a serpent, and we know again it's another sort of biblical allusion or biblical reference to the devil in the Bible, who appears as a serpent in order to tempt people. So again, quite interesting from both of them that they talk about putting on an act, so there's a lot of deception there. Now, many of these quotations will be useful for more than one theme or more than the themes I've just gone over. But this was just a really quick sort of whistle-stop tour of all of the characters and some ideas that we could talk about for each character. Don't forget to screenshot this as it is now with no highlighting on it, so you can print it or put it onto a Word document and highlight it and annotate it yourselves.